Well, hey there, Aletheia Church. Hope that you guys are doing well. Just going to recap my sermon from today in Judges chapter 4 and Judges chapter 5, where we looked at the story of Deborah. And one of the things I said is that Judges chapter 4 is a narrative of what God does, and then Judges chapter 5 is a song that Deborah and Barak recorded together or wrote down, I guess, and then would sing together about God's faithfulness and what He's done. And so I'm going to let you guys read the story in gospel community, just so that you have an idea of what's going on in the narrative. But I said that really this text forces us to ask three questions, and then the text answers them. And the first question was, what happens to those who refuse to heed God's commands? The second question is, what happens when God's presence arrives for His people? And then the third question was, what happens when God's people are willing to serve and follow Him? And so in that first section, what we saw was God's people once again turning to the idols and the nations around them. And this caused oppression, slavery, and all sorts of other things. And what we saw even in chapter 5 was the recording of how bad it really was, that people couldn't even travel the highways because of how dangerous it was. And so, as is common in the book of Judges, is the people are the authors of their own oppression and slavery because God gives them over to the people around them. And what happens is they eventually reach a breaking point and they cry out to God. And I talked about examples of that in my ministry experience over the years. I hope you guys will talk about that in your group tonight or whenever your group is meeting, about just the reality of what happens when we turn ourselves over to our idols, what the long-term consequences of that are. But I also said that one of the cool things we see in Judges chapter 4 and 5 is that when the people cry out, God answers in His mercy and His compassion. And really, He does that all throughout the book of Judges and all throughout the Old and New Testaments. But specifically, we see that in this story of God's presence showing up. And we saw how God sent Barak and Israel and Deborah to attack Sisera and defeat him in open battle. And we talked about in Judges chapter 5 the reality of actually how God Himself did that. And He did that through a storm. We see that in their recount in Judges chapter 5. And so kind of the beautiful thing here is we see God's presence delivers His people. And then as Sisera flees the battle, he meets Jael the Kenite, and she drives a tent peg through his head and kills the commander of the army of Canaan. And so, God delivers His people, and it says that at the end. And what God brings to His people is rest for 40 years. And so the last thing we saw was that God's presence delivers His people. That then we see what happens when God's people are willing to serve and follow Him. And what we saw is that they worship Him and that they obey Him, and that leads to blessing. That they sing and they repeat the righteous triumphs of the Lord, and then in that the commanders offer themselves to serve God and do what He's asked, and God liberates them and frees them. And we know that God offers the same thing to us as His church. We saw that in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, that God wants to use us as His church to make much of Him. And so I hope you guys have a great kind of talking through that and working through that in your gospel communities. I hope that the Lord is doing a work in you ahead of time so as to prepare you to maybe see where you're turning to idols and how you can turn back to Him and cry out. I'm praying for you guys. Have a great week. Go and be the church.